So in this week's column, in this week's Raja Mandala, you take off from Emmanuel Macron's statement that France is not going to be a vassal of America. This is in the context of his visit to China, saying that Taiwan may not be as big an issue as for Europe or France as it is for the US. This is all in the context, of course, of the Ukraine war and deep divisions that have come about as a result. How is this particular, you bring this out in the column, of course, but how is this particular time that France's so-called independence or assertion of being different from the US or not quite on the same page? Not worse is the wrong word, but more pronounced than, say, before, because France has this long history, sort of Gaullist independence, its own defense structure, manufacture, all things. How is this time different, or is it?
Yeah, I think there is a deep resentment among large sections of Europe that when it came to the war in Ukraine, they could not defend themselves. They have to rely on the Americans. And therefore, how dependence produces its own resentments. For the elite all these years, it has been convenient to let the Americans do the heavy lifting so that the Europeans could spend on welfare state. And they seemed fine because there was no imminent threat once the Soviet Union collapsed. But I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put them in a spot, and they feel helpless and even angrier that they need the Americans to help them, and that America has set the tone for the Ukraine response in the West. The second aspect is as you rightly said, I mean, France has a long tradition of Gaullism or independent foreign policy. They love, taking these broad, big positions, but they've also been careful not to take it too far. So there is, I think, skeptics would say, look, there's really posturing on the part of France. Therefore, they keep talking about, independence and autonomy, but in the end, they can't really break away from the United States. We saw that in the Iraq War. I mean, in 2003, 20 years ago, when France and Germany joined Russia to vote against the Iraqi invasion. But once invasion started, there was very little they could do. They had to accept the US invasion. But at this point, there is huge commercial interest for Europe. So I think the question is, should the Europeans sacrifice their commercial interests because there is a fight in a distant theater? It's one thing when it's next door, when the fire is next door, it clarifies your mind. But when it is a faraway fire, then I think the sense that, look, Europe has so much to lose if US and China, if China is isolated. So therefore, I think the business interests are the really driving factor. And given those interests, it is nice to then frame it as a problem of strategic autonomy. Now, for those in Asia, for example, that for our problem is Chinese expansionism. But I think unfortunate thing is Macron doesn't talk about it. China has changed borders in South China Sea, is bullying Japan in the East China Sea. It's doing things in Ladakh and various other parts. So I think because you frame it as distancing from the US, it's easy to ignore the China problem. But anyway, it's far away, so they don't lose much by doing that. But my sense is there is a lot of pressure on Macron to tone it down, and we're going to see in the G7 foreign ministers meeting that concluded today, there's an effort to reduce the differences.
This is a broad theme in your last few columns that we've been seeing off and on, and there is this sort of divisions within the so-called camps. They're not uniform in their approach to whether it is Ukraine, whether it's commercial interests, whether it's geopolitical interests across the borders. Northern Europe has their own concerns, and they formed their own defense alliance now, air defense alliance. You have Central European countries who see Russia very differently than, say, Germany, which has its own sense of history and guilt and ties with Russia. And, so there's all these divisions. Do you think the one line in your piece this time, everyone should read it, by the way, it has a lot more detail. It is on the indianexpress.com and probably in the description, wherever you're watching this video, is that that Russia is a vassal state, so-called, like you put it, or subaltern now, just as you're saying that Europe does not want to be, that Russia is the B player in this alliance with friendship without limits with China. does this the sense that China is the one that can bring Russia to the table and maybe it is essential to bringing this conflict to a close of some kind? Does that give China much greater leverage at this point than it would have had, say, even 10 years ago or 5 years ago?
No, no, absolutely. There's no question. I mean, I think what is the irony of it is Russia has no choice but to go to China. So it's a lot of the Russian emigres who, using the term Russia has become a vassal state for China. But many people have used this. I mean, junior partner, or Russia has become too dependent on China. I mean, that's a general argument. But what's interesting is Russia has no choice but to go to China. But the Europeans, who are actually victims of the Russian aggression, also seem to believe China is the solution. And where Macron put it, US is the problem. So I think for China, it's an interesting position where both sides of the European divide seem to think China is the answer to their problems. But of course, not so fast. The Americans will say Americans are still around. But I think the main point we're trying to convey is both halves of Europe, that is Russia in the east and the Western Europe, both of them are becoming relatively weaker in relation to America and China. Russia, which used to be the senior partner when the Soviet Union, in the days of the Soviet Union, today is clearly its economy is barely 1/10 of the size of China's. It has nuclear weapons, a lot more nuclear weapons than China has. But I think overall, what Chinese call the comprehensive national power, Russia has declined vis-a-vis China. And I think the same is true of Europe, has declined in relation to the United States. That I think that Europe, which dominated the world for so long, is divided and is in relative decline vis-a-vis America and China. So therefore, I think the question that we're posing for those who think about these issues is: are we moving back to a bipolar world? That is it now back to US and China? In the old days, it was Russia and America, but today, US and China are much more powerful than all the other powers. Though our own debate has for long been formulated as the pursuit of multipolarity, but when you have two dominant powers in the international system who are at each other's throats, then I think it's an assumption that the world is heading towards multipolarity is something we all need to rethink.
Then, interesting, another interesting point, you touched on it now, is that there is now, say, France has been one of the big movers in the Indo-Pacific with India, whether it is apart from outside of the Quad, they really, they've made all the right noises, let's put it that way. They're interested in this thing. That contradiction that you cannot hear China is the hegemon. I mean, it's or certainly the dominant military power and among the most dominant economic powers. How does that contradiction now between what you want in Europe and what you want in Asia, how does that balancing act work? And India has very much got a stake in that kind of thing, like you just pointed out.
Yeah.
We have a very aggressive China on our borders.
No, I think that is the challenge, actually. I mean, I think for India, certainly it's disappointing because France is a very important partner for India. France, wants to work with India in the Indian Ocean, in the Indo-Pacific. So it seemed that they were accepting the broad proposition, China is part of the problem. But the way Macron formulated it during just on his way back from Beijing, it kind of undermines his own arguments. He's forgetting our arguments, his own arguments. Therefore, we'll have to wait and see whether he'll make some corrections, reassure France's partners in this part of the world and say, look, we're not simply accepting Chinese domination. Because I think the G7 foreign ministers meeting, which is just concluded in Japan, on Tuesday, they're already beginning to show some common position that Russia is a problem. We need to engage China where possible, but we must resist China where China poses a threat. So I think there is some course correction I can see. But I think the bigger problem for India is this, long-term strategic problem. The idea that India can rely on Russia or Europe to build a multipolar world and to contribute to the balancing of China, that is now increasingly in doubt. Because, as we said, both Russia and Europe have huge stakes in China. So it's not clear if they can actually have the capacity and the will to deal with Chinese power. And if they have both of them have deep economic interests, Russia has political interests. So can we bet on Europe, both halves of Europe, to produce balance of power in Asia? So which means actually the US remains the principal external power that can shape the equations in the region.
No,
And I think for the Chinese too, they see themselves as equal to the United States, and they don't think much of the Europeans or Russians.
So, the final question, you touched on this thing that one of the major, there is of course a hard military kind of reason behind the superpower, China and US being superpowers, but there is also the commercial aspect. What seems to be giving China a lot of leverage in many cases is the deep commercial ties. Do you think, I mean, as you point out, that India must focus on that? Do you think these sort of trade agreements that have been hanging in the balance are the first kind of step to doing that? Because they have been a long time coming with Europe as a whole and individual countries in Europe. That at least deepens ties, and if ever there is a question of taking sides, they have interests here as well, that they at least have to do a balancing act.
No, what we are arguing is that, look, we need to step up the engagement with Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, Europe is not a geopolitical actor, but it remains a major economic actor. And there are a lot of pickings to be taken, which is what the Chinese are doing, invested quite heavily in engaging the Chinese, unlike the Russians who have fought with the Europeans. The Chinese have cultivated a whole range of business relationships, technology relationships. So they see the value that Europe can contribute to the rise and strengthening of China. And I think the same logic applies to us. And if the Europeans are willing to follow the money in China, I don't see why they won't do it in India.
Yeah.
So I think for us, there is a debate in Europe about China plus one strategy. The question is, can India make itself a lot more attractive? I mean, I think that is the question. We make it easy. There is a lot of things we can do with the Europeans, because I think it is who can pick up the low-hanging fruit in Europe on technology, on commerce. That I think is the big challenge for Asia. My sense is Chinese are way ahead, but I think we need to step up our game to be able to engage Europe and to derive what benefits we can.
Right. Thanks so much, everyone. Read the column. It is on the indianexpress.com, and we will see you again next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akash.